I hated them all. We didn't have one single guard in Kinkasaki that I could say with any degree of honesty showed any compassion whatsoever. Not one single guard. I got a feeling they enjoyed doing what they were doing to us.
Arthur Titherington was 21, an army dispatch rider when he became a prisoner of the Japanese in 1942. He was to spend the rest of the war as a slave labourer, mainly at the infamous Kinkasaki copper mine in Taiwan.
But it's just impossible to describe the sheer... You look around you, you see men with their ribs sticking out, with legs like matchsticks, and you don't need a mirror because you know damn well that's what you look like. And every day, worse and worse and worse. You went for your breakfast, and you were given a cup, a teacup of boiled rice. You then went out into the cold of the morning, and you were knocked about, beaten, for no obvious reason. You then went into this awful inferno of a mine with somebody at some time in the day coming round and beating the hell out of you because he thought you weren't working hard enough. And then the following morning, it was repeated again and again and again, day after day after day, with absolutely no respite whatsoever.
Originally, there were over 500 prisoners at Kinkasaki. When Japan finally surrendered, only 90 were still alive. Arthur was one of them, but he was close to death, his body ravaged by disease and malnutrition.
I suppose I was dead, but I hadn't stopped breathing. Fortunately, the war finished, but by that time I weighed something like 5 stone, just over 5 stone.
Phyllis Jameson was 13 years old when she became a prisoner of war. As the Japanese invaded Singapore in 1942, Phyllis and her family were among thousands of civilians who crowded onto ships to escape.
When we left Singapore on that boat, and we thought we were going to be free, my mother, my brother, Sonny, and my 5 sisters, Nora, Dorothy, Ida, Kathleen, and Marie. The ship was torpedoed, and that was the last time I saw my brother and my sisters and my mum. And our lifeboat was just cut, you know, it didn't just sink into the water, it was just cut and flopped into the sea. And we were there for 3 days and 2 nights before we were picked up. And that was the start of our journey to the prison camp.
Phyllis became one of 57,000 British civilians held by the Japanese. She was marched to Palembang prison camp in Java.
I had nothing in that camp to remember anything of anybody. Just to try and survive the Japanese torments and ill treatment. That's all I had to look forward to for 3.5 years. At night time, that's when the sexual harassment started. It wasn't a rape, you know, I wouldn't call it a rape. It was just touching your body, and you just couldn't do anything about it. You're too scared.
Private Sidney Tavender was captured by the Japanese in 1941 after heavy fighting in the Malayan jungle. He became a slave labourer building the Thai-Burma Railroad. Dozens of prisoners died every day from brutality, starvation and illness. It became known as the Death Railway.
Well, the railway was something that nobody would ever experience again in their life. You worked from anything from 12 to 16 hours a day with no shoes, a little G-string, sun on your back, getting burnt to buggery. If you slipped, you all got a beating. You existed on 3 cups of rice a day. You could go to bed at night and say goodnight to the chap that's sleeping on the bamboo slats next to you, and you wake up in the morning and you'd be dead. The existence was absolutely brutal.
At London's Imperial War Museum, the fate of 22,000 British who died in Japanese camps is documented. Germany apologized quickly and fully for its war crimes, but the Japanese only acknowledged their atrocities publicly 2 years ago. Those who survived have received little or no compensation.
I've never received anything. My dad had 7 death certificates and £45 cheque for the loss of his family. That was the end for him, because my dad was ill in hospital when I had to take him this information, and he says, that's it then, my dear. He said, that's it. That's the end.
It may be 50 years since the war, but these prisoners have never given up hope of winning the compensation they feel Japan owes them for the horrors they suffered. 2 years ago, lawyer Martin Day agreed to help.
We looked at the various possibilities, and the more I looked into it, the more I felt that taking the Japanese on in their own territory in Tokyo was the right way forward. And I was amazed to find that we were able to obtain Japanese lawyers who were not only interested but very keen to take on the cases. And you know, here we now are, 2 years later, about to commence proceedings in Tokyo. So we've come a long way.
We're suing the Japanese government. This is something that I never had dreamt of. I really wouldn't. I never thought it would get to this stage.
Phyllis has agreed to take part in the court action in Tokyo. Her husband Tom understands only too well why she feels she must. He too was a prisoner of the Japanese. They first met on board the SS Ranchi as they sailed to freedom at the end of the war.
I didn't want to do it first, and then Tom and me sat down and he said, it's time you had it all spoken about. He said, you kept it for 50 years. So he said it's time it was told of what the Japanese did.
Anne Levick became a prisoner of the Japanese when she was 14 years old. As secretary of the British Civilian Internees Group, she'll be accompanying Phyllis.
She has the courage to go and represent us and to speak before the lawyers, etc. But I'm going there really to speak on behalf of all of us, those who are not going, and to try and make the Japanese understand that what they did to us was totally unnecessary. We were non-belligerent, just civilians going about our normal business. And to inflict such pain and cruelty on so many of us was really unforgivable.
I don't know what to expect, you know. And I've never seen any Japanese till I go to Tokyo, and I just don't know what I'd feel, because all I've met is Japanese guards up to now.
The ex-prisoners have come to the land of their former enemy. From the ashes of war has risen an economic superpower. Tokyo is its heart. The group has just a few days to launch their case for compensation. It'll be difficult. It's only 2 years since Japan even acknowledged its wartime atrocities.
I think there is a good chance during the course of this year that the Japanese will decide that this is a matter that is just too embarrassing to continue, that it is such a key period for the Japanese in terms of developing their influence. It's a reminder to everybody that there is a side to Japan that we find difficult to understand because they've found it themselves so difficult to apologise for what they did.
The visit has created huge media interest. For the first time in 50 years, the Japanese will be hearing British civilians talk about the inhuman treatment they suffered during the war.
I was interned when I was 13, and I was shipwrecked and lost my family. I even find it worse without a family than when I had the sexual harassment in camp. With all the hard manual work we girls had to do, I was unable to have children when I got married. But I would like the world to know that there are women who are still suffering under what the Japanese did to us during the war. In bed at night, they used to come and just maul your body about. I just can't talk about it.
夜中に突然、要するに日本兵が入ってきて、部屋の中で寝ている私の体を触ったりしたと。
I thought Phyllis maintained a remarkable degree of calm throughout the whole proceedings. I know she broke down there, but I don't know who wouldn't. That reflects really the agony after 50 years that is still churning up inside people.
Wartime scandal is already in the headlines. Tonight, the former POWs are meeting another woman who's claiming compensation from the Japanese. The so-called comfort women were forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese army. It's one more ugly chapter in the wartime treatment of civilians that's only recently been officially acknowledged.
I think they're very brave ladies, and I'm glad they are going to speak out of the horrors they've been through.
This is San Shindo. She was only 15 when she was taken by Japanese soldiers from her home in occupied Korea. She spent the rest of the war held captive in an army brothel where she was constantly raped. She's demanding compensation equivalent to an army commander's pension. After the meeting, the British group are keen to meet her.
May I ask Shindu a question as how has she coped up to now with her guilt, because I still feel very guilty after all these years.
Same, yes. I felt guiltiness. I couldn't get rid of the guilty feelings, so I couldn't tell anybody. So that's why I live in nearby the ocean. So one time I went to the beach and I tried to kill myself, but I just maybe hasn't dared to kill myself. But I really suffered.
I felt like that twice to try to kill myself.
If I killed myself, if I die, I don't need to remember all those sufferings and all the pains.
I'm just too flat to say anything.
This train ran on the tracks that Sid and thousands of other prisoners were forced to build. It's the only reminder Tokyo has of the more unpleasant side of its military history.
Oh, this was the old boy that used to take all the supplies up. It was originally run on the Singapore to Bangkok official railway line. We tried to sabotage it. Otherwise, it's still in its old order. The way we sabotaged it was, or attempted to sabotage it, was by opening up this section here and removing this cock here, which would reduce all the power of the steam. But basically, we didn't have any luck. Well, it's rather good. I rather like the layout of it, but I object to the wording, numerous casualties. During the railway construction, the word should be murder. It's the way they write up these things, saying casualties when it wasn't casualties. It's blatant brutality.
The irony is that this symbol of prisoners' suffering is next door to the Yasukuni Shrine. Here, the Japanese war dead are worshipped as divine spirits. 8 million people come to pay their respects every year. The dead include the war criminals who were executed for their part in horrendous atrocities. When they, as well as the other war dead, are commemorated each August, there's always a controversy regarding the attendance of prominent politicians.
Lots of people in Japan regard this shrine as a very sacred place, but many other people, the Japanese people, including me, regard this shrine as a kind of symbol of the reactionary Japanese past, because this shrine does not address a certain aspect of the war. Only the sufferings of the Japanese people is emphasized, and the problems of the present war is rather ignored.
Recent opinion polls show most older Japanese people don't agree with paying war compensation. But people born after the war are in favor.
I think to show our respect for the people who have been victimized by the Japanese government at the time of war, and to show our sincere apology, I think we should.
Polls also show that the post-war generation wants the truth about Japan's wartime atrocities taught in schools. Until recently, very little has been included in school history books.
We are here because we are claiming compensation from the Japanese government for what happened to us during the war. Do you know anything about that?
No.
Nothing at all?
In the media or television, newspapers? I heard most of the about war in America, but I never heard of most of the war in Japan, POWs, and what happened, in Japan, in my schools.
For decades, Japan's school books ignored wartime atrocities. The new textbooks are different.
They contain words in those textbooks which I never thought they'd ever print, about the things that they did and were done by the Japanese during the war. I find that encouraging. The young people are now beginning to know what happened, and therefore I think this is the beginning of a change within the people of Japan, and it will have an effect.
The British Embassy in Tokyo. The former prisoners have been invited to meet the ambassador, and they're hoping for some support in pursuing their claim.
Good morning, good morning. Please come in.
Great. We've been to the shrine.
Oh, lovely. Very nice to meet you. I'm Jenny Marston.
I have this relatively...
It's the best place in Bangkok.
Best one there, is it?
Is there some sort of compensation, reparations?
What's worried us is that the ambassador seems to have had his own agenda, which is separate to that which we want to pursue.
The ambassador supports John Major's plan to set up a charity to help POWs with money from Japanese industry. But Japan's wealthiest companies have given nothing.
I thought it's just a lot of talk and no action. That's what we want, somebody to commit themselves and to fight with us for this claim. But all of them are just sitting back at the moment.
I think it's quite clear that the embassy is embarrassed about our presence here. They'd rather we disappeared. I think it was quite clear in the end that for them, the economic links that they have with Japan are far, far more important than a bunch of meddling POWs.
Arthur, Anne and Martin are finally going to see a representative of the Japanese government. Mr. Okada of the Foreign Office has just returned from Kobe, site of Japan's biggest recent earthquake.
He broke down completely, and I really felt very sorry for him. But he was a sympathetic young man, and I hope perhaps that feeling may have worked to our favour. But you can't be sure, because, he took the official line, of course.
The Japanese government's official line is that it has no obligations to the POWs because of a treaty it signed after the war.
At San Francisco, peace-loving nations near success as delegates arrive at the War Memorial Opera House for the final session of the Japanese Peace Conference.
After the war, Allied forces met with Japan's leaders to sign the San Francisco peace settlement. This included a one-off compensation deal for Japan's former prisoners. Because Japan was financially crippled by the war, the payment was minimal.
It remains only for Japan to sign, and there is a hush as Mr. Yoshida brings the conference to a successful conclusion.
They've been paid the princely sum of £76.50 for the POWs and less than £50 for the civilians. Although we're talking 50 years ago, that was pretty derisory then.
Our government of that time inserted a clause 14, which in my opinion was absolutely reprehensible of whoever thought it up, that there would be no further claims made upon Japan either by the nation or its nationals. And I maintain that they had no right to do that.
We say that a government is not able to bind the hands of an individual in any event, so that we say we've got a good claim in compensation and claiming individual damages for these people.
I feel very sorry for those people who have suffered a lot. Sorry for all the anguishes of the people involved. I hope the people can get over the problems as quickly as possible. But this is a very serious problem. And secondly, as an official of the government, I would like to say that we have implemented, we have fulfilled the obligations which is defined in the treaties, in the relevant treaties, including San Francisco Treaty.
It's easy to say sorry. I mean, you know, this word is overused. I don't know how often it's meant when people use it. But in the case of the Japanese, it's only, what, a couple of years ago that they've begun to say sorry at all. So, sorry isn't enough.
The moment arrives when the former prisoners step into Tokyo's Central Court to begin their historic action against the Japanese government. They're claiming damages of £13,000 each for the inhuman suffering that they endured.
The payment is nothing more than a token. All right, there are some prisoners, some ex-prisoners, who could use the money, I've no doubt. But that's not the issue. That really isn't the issue. It is no more than a token, an act of contrition.
This preliminary hearing is just the first stage in a legal battle that could take many years and involve the ex-prisoners making many return journeys to Japan to give evidence.
I'm surprised that the Japanese have allowed it to get to this stage. There'll be an awful lot of dirty linen washed, but it won't be mine. I would have thought that they wouldn't want us to go through this for their sake.
Yokohama Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery, where thousands of British POWs who did not survive are honoured.
I can try and forget, but I don't know about forgiving. There's too much gone by to have that kind of forgiveness.
When you look at the gravestones, and you look at the ages of these young men, 20, 21, 22, 23 years old, and the whole thing was so absolutely unnecessary, because don't forget, they weren't killed in war. As far as they were concerned, their war was over, and they died as prisoners of the Japanese. And that makes it even worse, because many, many of them could still have been alive with proper treatment. I shall pursue it to the bitter end. I shall pursue it right until the day I die. I don't intend to let them forget what they did and why we're doing what we're doing. If they had any sense, they'd settle out of court, draw a line underneath and say, right, that's it, now let's start again.